Okay, so welcome everyone to the SFU Sports Analytics Virtual Seminar Series. Today we have Dr. Albert Cohen, who's going to speak to us about European football player evaluation, integrating financial models and network theory. Dr. Cohen is the Director of Actuarial Science, as well as the Graduate Certificate in Sports Analytics at Michigan State University. He obtained his bachelor and master's degrees in applied mathematics from Simon Fraser University's Applied Mathematics program, followed by obtaining a PhD in mathematics at Carnegie Mellon University. There, Dr. Cohen worked on problems in stochastic analysis, finance, and material science under the supervision of David Kinderlehrer. Dr. Cohen's current work focuses on the application of stochastic analysis to structural modeling problems in quantitative finance and sports analytics. Recent publications include the expansion of the Moneyball approach to prediction in baseball and leveraging techniques from network theory and financial modeling to validating player salaries in soccer. So today, the talk will feature a new method for player evaluation in European football that results from fusing principles from financial mathematics and network theory. The valuation model leverages a passing matrix to encapsulate player interactions on the field, using centrality measures to quantify individual influence, and uses these performance measures in conjunction with a stochastic revenue model for their team. This provides a dynamic and individualized framework for ascertaining a player's fair market value. The methodology is empirically validated through a case study in European football, employing real-world match and financial data. And this work is joint with Dr. Jimmy Risk of Cal State Pomona. So I think, Albert, this is our first actuary to present within the series. So we're excited about that. And I will turn it over to you. I'll just stop sharing my screen, and then you should be able to share yours.
Good. Perfect. Can you folks see that?
I can.
Perfect. Okay. Well, it's an absolute pleasure to talk about this work. We just published this in January. We've been working on it for about 12 to 18 months. And one of the great pleasures in my life as well has been able to do curriculum development in sports analytics and this overlap with financial mathematics, which Carnegie Mellon really is an epicenter of quantitative finance research. Being the director of the actuarial program also has given me some leeway to look for new avenues for actuaries to find roles in industry. And one of the new ones is looking at specialty lines in sports insurance, specifically athlete insurance, team insurance, event insurance. And so even on the actuarial and financial mathematics side, when you look at firms that are investing in either sports betting or athlete insurance, this has become really a deep field of its own. And looking at journals like Journal of Quantitative Analytics in Sports, Journal of Sports Analytics, even American Economic Review, you're finding that there's a deep interest in these kinds of work. And I'm glad to be part of it. And again, thank you for letting me come back to my alma mater. I spent many years up on Burnaby Mountain. Never thought I'd be coming back to talk about this, but it's a great pleasure. So the dynamic model that we're going to present basically looks to link pay and performance in soccer. And this is a very old idea, kind of going back to labor econometrics. And then we'll talk a little bit about how we can integrate finance, network theory, and sports analytics to give a way to analyze what's going on the field and link it to the revenue that's coming in. And we'll talk about what this captures and what this doesn't capture. A lot on both of those sides. We'll give an example also, and we'll do a case study. And after that, I'll be happy to take any questions. And I've also got some ideas for future research for any of the young people in the field that would want to look at some of the things that I have no idea how to do, but I think would be interesting. So essentially, and this is everybody on the call knows this, European football is a very complex endeavor. There's a dearth of goals. A lot of people here in the United States will joke about soccer, 0-0 or 1-0 game, and not understanding what the excitement is. But, if you're a soccer fan like us, you realize that there's a lot of nuance on the field, and try to capture that nuance and understand how does that link to a dollar figure, or even if not a dollar figure, just performance, like who did what in the game. So in my background in quantitative finance and in actuarial science, I'm interested in structural models. So I'm interested in a machine where you pull a lever and something comes out. And so the question is, what are the levers in sports? Well, specifically in soccer, you pass and you score. Those are the two main objects that, of the game, is specifically to score, but also to hopefully make it exciting. And Full disclosure, my mom is Brazilian, so I love the flair that Brazilians, at least the national team, play with. But you've seen that even that style has changed, and some of this analysis could maybe be used to analyze that. Okay. So specifically, the goal that we have is to have a player valuation model that looks at the passing as being the structural, idea in soccer. How do you value things that aren't goals? And also look at this dynamically. Can we make a stochastic pricing model that we're very comfortable with in quantitative finance for pricing options, corporate bonds, these kinds of things? Can we use that kind of thinking, or even annuities? Can we use that kind of thinking to price player contracts? And we're going to do that. And we're also going to give you some English Premier League analysis and show that this model has at least some reasonable grounding in what we see, on the field. So any start of player valuation model, in my opinion, has to start with Curt Flood as the first Major League Baseball free agent, and Gerald Scully, who was a labor econometrician, who wrote about this, which specifically said, after you're done with your contract, you don't have to owe the team your rights any longer. So once that business is done, you're a free agent. And so the question is, how do you as a free agent get valued by a potential team? How do they look at you? How do they look at your potential contribution, not just to the field, but in terms of the revenue? And so the idea is that, can I link what I pay you, not necessarily your value, but what I pay your salary? There's a distinction here. How can I link your salary based to your performance, or at least my estimated or expected performance? And so Gerald Scully, I think, never wrote about this again. He came into the field, he basically laid the foundational tools, and then he left. And the idea is quite simply that for every dollar you bring in, for every marginal or extra dollar you bring in, you should get paid a fraction of that. So take away some for administrative, and agency costs. But your compensation should be linked to the revenue that you're bringing in based on the play that you bring to the field, but also you inspire among your teammates. The second work that we found was also looking at the valuation of a player. And it was really interesting because my background in applied mathematics is looking at things like partial differential equations, Monte Carlo simulation, numerical analysis. And so we found this fantastic paper by Reha Tunaru and his Howard Clark, and I forget Mr. Viney, but Tunaru, Clark, and Viney, or the TCV model, they used a stochastic model, and they also talked a little bit about partial differential equations, so linking with Black-Scholes pricing. And they came up with a way to look at the value of a player's contract linked to the final time transfer payment. And so before the recording, we were having a great discussion about valuing transfer payments accurately. And so the value of a player as you're ending towards the contract should also be linked to your transfer market value. We're not going to talk about this, but this is one of the things I'd suggest at the end that we can maybe add to this model that we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about salary, but valuation using PD models did inspire partially what we're doing. And we should know that Coluccia, they actually did an analysis back in the Italian Serie A league looking at a goalie, and they did some calibration there. The numerical analysis was interesting. I think that that's a paper that's ripe for expansion, but that's just my naive opinion. Finally, in one of the honors of giving this talk at Simon Fraser's, you have a gentleman named Stephen Easton, who's in the economics department there, and also Dwayne Rockerby, who is at the University of Lethbridge. They wrote a fantastic book, basically looking at contract options, trying to value players based on a dynamic, but let's say binomial or even a trinomial multi-period asset pricing model. So the stuff that we do, that we teach our students in third and fourth year, and at some programs in their master's programs for quantitative finance, they use these tools to price contracts for players. And one of the things that they also did is they talked about the optionality of a contract. So 2 single-year contracts is different than 1 single 2-year contract. So the ability to, re-sign a player, that has some value. We don't talk about this in our salary valuation model, but that'd be a great feature to incorporate. Nonetheless, we wanted to look at this sort of discrete versus continuous approach, talk a little bit about partial differential equations, talk a little bit about simulation, and link them together into a dynamic model that we think would help to price soccer. So one of the things that we really got inspired by was the TCV paper, where they looked at a performance valuation. So everybody here that's watched, the Premier League, you've heard of the Carling Opta, or a point scale for the performance of a player during a game. So after a game, you get a score and you say that that's the valuation for your play for the whole game. Now, that isn't, that's somewhat not transparent. I mean, there are some things you can imagine that are being put into the recipe to come up with that number, but it's still something that is proprietary to Opta, which I think is Stats LLC, is the parent company. So we wanted to take that and actually do a little bit different modeling. But TCV, with their player performance modeling, they did the following. They looked at the revenue earned per game, and they looked at, for each player J, their points. And they said that if you were to sum from 1 through, let's say, 11 players on the field, if you looked at each player's contribution and you take player J, you want to say that, okay, fine, what did player J generate in terms of dollars? So if you look at the revenue per point, so if you look at the entire team, let's say 11 players in total scored 2,000 points, the number of dollars divided by 2,000 points is the value per point in dollars. So if, let's say, I had 2,000 points and I had $2 million of revenue in that game, so 2 million divided by 2,000, that's the value per point. The only problem in the model for the TCV paper is that they looked at individual players as having a geometric Brownian motion or log normal process. And then they said, well, the sum of these player points is also going to be log normal. And it made the calculations easier. But the sum of log normals isn't necessarily log normal. And so one of the things we did, probably my favorite calculation in all the paper and the simplest math you're going to see, is instead of looking at the number of points that you score as player J times the dollar value per point for the team. So instead of P sub J, this is equation here at the bottom, instead of P sub J times the dollar value per point, we looked at the shifting that fraction as being well, what is your performance share times the dollar value? And so it seems like the most trivial of mathematics, and it is, but it shifts the paradigm to how we think about valuing players. Instead of talking about the dollar value per point, let's look at dollars and performance share. So what is your number of points divided by the total number of points? That's a fraction between 0 and 1. And now we can use that reasoning to say, look, going back to the original Scully approach, the marginal revenue that you bring, well, every dollar that's coming in, you're earning a share of that based on your share of the team's total performance. And we thought that that was an easier way to model this. And it turned out that we could also link it to graph theory, network theory, and we actually had some success doing it this way. So again, the mathematics is trivial here, but it's just a paradigm shift. And shifting that fraction into what's being the ratio, we're able to do a different model, essentially. So looking at pi sub j, pi being the fraction, if you're completely egalitarian and you distribute, you say that each player of the 11 on the field is worth roughly 9.1% of the share of the performance. Clearly, that's not true. There's going to be injuries, substitutions. You're not going to match up, let's say, with a team as well as you did, let's say, the last game's team. And so each player is going to have varying performance share as expected. So the baseline is roughly 9.1%, but you're looking for players when you're doing your scouting that maybe they're contributing 10 or 12% of their team's total performance share. That's immediately the thinking that you might have as a scout. Look, I'm looking for a player that's overperforming. What does that mean? Well, he's driving the team's performance in such a way that he or she is over producing based on a baseline. Okay, now a couple things to think about is that not only is that dynamic because of play on the field, but also maybe with the horizon of their contract. It's quite often that players, I'm not going to name names, but being a Northwest sports fan, there are teams that sign a player to a huge contract, and immediately the next season that player is just not doing well. And I see a lot of smiles, and so I think y'all know what I'm talking about. But as a sports fan, this is sort of the bane of our existence, that you finally have the money, you finally have the salary cap room, if that's the league you're playing in, you sign this player, and they just disappear. And that's going to happen. But the question is there a way to at least rank that performance? And that's what we're trying to do. So, in valuing player performance, as mentioned, there are some closed form, recipes for doing so. But everybody, at a soccer game can walk in with a clipboard and just track the passes. And in fact, there are great video programs like OpenCV that you can do this automatically. So you have a video coach. That's a traditional, position here in North American sports, but you're going to see that being automated more and more. Looking at teams as a network of players, though, is really interesting. There's some great books that are coming out on, for example, team sports and graph theory. But these are the three main papers I'd like to quote. The network theory analysis paper by Lopez and Touchette, they published in 2012, and they did a look back at the 2010 World Cup final between Spain and the Netherlands. And they talked about in that final, but also in the lead up to it, which teams were the most connected, which teams had, the highest what are called centrality measures. And we'll talk a little bit about that. Which teams, had players that were directing all the play versus which teams had players that were, clustered around each other. And then this paper in the Journal of Human Kinetics using network metrics in soccer is a great paper, and it's open access. I was able to, I think is the NIH has got it on their portal. The one on the archive, the first one is also available. And the second one is the one that we use the most in our paper. I'm going kind of fast. Maybe I can stop and see if there's any questions or no? Okay. So the basic idea is that we're going to look now at a performance share for each player. We're going to use some ideas from graph theory, looking at a player within a team as being a node within a graph. And we're going to look at now the evolution of the fraction of revenue that the player can be attributed to, it can be attributed to the player, which is the multiplication of the player performance share pie and the revenue, and also a fraction that is dynamic as well, which is what portion of your revenue are you going to dedicate to salary? And I should stop here to say that talking to a colleague of mine in the NHL, we were talking about this paper a little bit, and he said, well, that's easy because for us, we have a salary cap. So we know what our expenses are. We know what part of our revenue is thrown into player salaries. But if you look at uncapped leagues, let's say like the Major League Baseball or European soccer, that's something that's floating. And you can argue that, depending on the league and on the team specifically, those can vary pretty widely. All right, so if you have M as in Michael players, you can look at the passes between players I and J. So from Bob to Michael and from Michael to Bob, those passes aren't the same number. Bob can pass to Michael more than Michael passes back to Bob. And so as a coach, you can look at the game in totality, but you're maybe gathering a sort of a temperature of how connected your team is, but is there an actual number that you can look at? And the answer is many numbers. You just look at the matrix of passes between players, and you adjoin to that two extra columns and rows to do with passes that were successful versus unsuccessful. So a successful pass could be one that leads to a shot, a dangerous shot, let's say, one that's a goal or a near miss, and an unsuccessful one is a takeaway, for example. And in the end, I've got a great resource for some examples for this as well. So for us, we're going to look at the probability that player J is involved in a possession, given that that possession was successful and not unsuccessful. And we're going to say that that's going to measure the quality of our player specifically. But if you want to look at it relative to the team, I can look at that ratio as being the probability for player J divided by the sum of the probabilities for all the players on the team. And I can look at this dynamically. And so now I've gone from, hey, the original TCV model is dollars per point. And now we're looking at, let's look at performance share times the total number of dollars. But that performance share is stochastic. And so that performance share we should model somehow by looking at each game in terms of a passing matrix. And the question is, based on that passing matrix, we can do now a probability, an empirical probability of, you being, part of the chain of a successful play. And the question is now, if we can use that estimation, that probability-based estimation of your performance share, can we use that now to calibrate a model that is dynamic that we can use to go forwards? So historical data maybe will justify or confirm our bias that, yes, this is evolving stochastically, but can I use that to at least estimate some parameters for a model that I'm going to propose? Perfect. And so here comes the mathematics. So for us, we're going to look at a coupled dynamic stochastic system, a stochastic differential equation specifically. So we're going to look at revenue and performance share pi as being these stochastic processes. So R, if you've done any quantitative finance, is a geometric Brownian motion, sort of the basis of Black-Scholes pricing. The pi is a number between 0 and 1. And so our theta, our pi star, and our sigma pi have to be chosen such that our d pi evolves between 0 and 1. We're going to assume that the risk drivers, dw pi, Brownian motion for pi, Brownian motion for r, are correlated with some constant rho. And we're going to assume that at the beginning of every time, we know what our process A sub t is. We know what the proportion is. So if you're doing this as the manager of your own team, you know what you're going to be, in the future attributing as a fraction of your revenue to player salaries. And if you're in a cap league, then that problem even goes away. Some of the nice things that Jimmy Risk, my co-author and dear friend, convinced me is that, if you look at these Pearson processes, they have very nice equilibrium or long-term distributions, specifically beta distributions between 0 and 1. And the sum of individual pies also has a nice distribution. And so one of the things that we're looking at is to expand this into clusters of players and their correlations with other clusters. Okay, but with that in mind, this is our stochastic differential equation system. And so now that we proposed it, the hard work is estimating your thetas, your pi stars, your mu's, your sigma r's. And not being a statistician, my answer to that is, seems like maximum likelihood estimation was the best tool. And Jimmy nodded and said, yes, go back to doing math. And I said, okay, thank you. And that was what we did. But here comes now the actuarial part. It was mentioned that I'm doing actuarial science, and absolutely, and quantitative finance. Individual players for individual games contribute some number or some fraction between 0 and 1, some percentage of the play. Based on that percentage of the play and the revenue earned for that game, we have a dollar figure. But that dollar figure is stochastic. It's performance-linked contributions. And at each time in the future, whether you look at an aggregate for the season or per game, it's random. And so from the very basic financial instrument that we can think of, this is just a swap. We're swapping constant or fixed salaries for floating performance-linked revenue shares. So again, I'm having fixed payments for floating payments. This is an annuity. This is an interest rate swap. This is whatever you like. This is a fundamental financial tool. And so what it took was for us to get to this point is, okay, fine, how do we value that performance-linked share? It's really Professor Tsunaru in his paper from 20 years ago talking about that it's a random process. We try it as a geometric Brownian motion, but that's for an individual player. We modified it to performance share, but we still use a geometric Brownian motion for revenue. And now we're looking at the product of two random processes, stochastic processes that are correlated. What's coming up is going to be some more advanced mathematics, but at the very least, if you walk away from anything on this talk, is a contract is just a financial instrument, fixed for floating. You as a player want some stability in terms of fixed payments for a known term, and I want to get the most performance out of you. At some point, we have to agree on a contract that says, look, for 3 years, I will sign you for this many dollars per year, or in European football, this many pounds per week. And in return, I have your rights for 3 years. And as was mentioned, there's optionality, there's transfer value, there's lots of things that are inherent to the valuation that are not in here, but at the very least, I give you some fixed payments You give me some floating performance, and I'm going to hope that you're going to overperform what I thought you would. So the equation at the very bottom is that swap. I take a constant rate R, continuous rate R, to discount those payments at times 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So think of a number line. A time 1, a time 2, dot, 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 till let's say time capital T, the horizon or the term of the contract T. And in return, you give me some performance that is going to be variable. So I'm going to take an average of that. Now, you can see there's a discounting with the rate R for the constant payments, but a rate R plus lambda to do for the performance share. And that's because there is some risk. So when you do quantitative finance from the very beginning, you talk about what's called risk neutrality or replication. You're replicating a payment based on a stock, let's say, whose value you're deriving to get a stock option. There's no tradable in here necessarily. And so the risk premium that we have to add in to allow for the fact that we don't have risk neutrality can be to do with injuries. It could be to do with scarcity of finding a comparable player at your position, so like a liquidity risk. So all of that is shoved into this extra yield that I demand on your floating performance being lambda. And so Rockerby and Easton are fantastic at talking about this in terms of market beta, or another way to estimate it. For us, lambda is simply just going to be injury related. So again, I have no chance of default in terms of me paying you your contract value C1, C2, dot, dot, dot. You have some possibility of just, missing a year or two. And we're going to see that in our case study. So that injury related risk is I'm going to discount your risky performance share by not just, let's say, 2% for my regular rate R. I'm going to discount it by 3%. I'm going to ask for an extra percentage of compensation to do with the fact that you might miss some games. There's just some risk associated with you. And estimating lambda would be a fantastic project for anybody that's watching this as an actuary to do it better than we did, which is, again, just simple empirical estimation. Okay, so another thing we'd like to talk about is that, let me just go back here. This is the locking in of your contract value at time 0. So at time 0, I look at a timeline of what I'm going to pay you at time 1, at time 2, dot, dot, dot. So at time 0, you and I shake hands, and let's just say we push all the payments to the end of the season. That's my swap. But when I fix or commit myself to these payments, what's going to happen is that I'm going to be maybe regretful, right? So I don't have insurance against you underperforming. And so the question would be, could I design such an insurance market or a credit default swap or something where I could insure against underperformance? So how do I measure underperformance would be to say, well, wait a minute. What if for shorter periods of time, let's say a period length H, I could value your performance and reestablish what your salary should be? So if I had a performance-linked salary that was not compounded year over year, but game over game, that would be a great way to measure your dollar valued performance. And again, actuaries do this all the time. You look at annuities. You look at annuities that pay premiums and benefits yearly, or premiums and benefits monthly, daily. There's no randomness necessarily for the very first way, deterministic way of doing it. But if you have some randomness, this is sort of a way you do this in actuarial science as well. So again, at the beginning of time t till the end of the time t plus h being small, let's say a week, so game to game, could I rebalance my contract? So could I say, look, this is your performance up until now. I have to rebalance your contract. You see this in the National Football League and stuff like that. You have renegotiations of contracts. Could I do this game by game? This would be a way to develop an insurance market, you could argue, or a way to at least value your performance, on a much tighter schedule than just locking in a contract for 3 years and hoping for the best. Again, solving that coupled system of stochastic differential equations, you can actually get a relatively closed form approximation. I know that's a just contradiction in terms, but we can get a approximating formula to solve for what the equation 6 over here would be. So I can actually solve based on my current revenue, my current fraction, a sub t plus h, which is I know at time t, it's pre-visible. My estimation of lambda, my estimation of your growth rate for your revenue mu, your current state pi sub t, your long run pi star, all of these parameters I can estimate. Now, if you're a PDE or partial differential equation person, you can say, that looks sort of like a perturbation solution for a small parameter rho. And yes, I would argue with that. It's just a Taylor approximation. We should note, though, if rho equals 0, if there's no correlation between player performance and revenue, then this solution is exact. But if rho is small or time is small, then this solution is not bad. So again, equation 7 is a way for us to, given today's time t, can I estimate what your salary should be based on what it is locked in at? And that's a way for me to measure how well you're doing in this contract. So if I'm locked in as a general manager and I've got regret, can I at least measure that regret? And once we can measure it, then who knows, maybe one day markets would develop to price against that, some sort of insurance. So to recap, performance share instead of dollars per point. The performance share is something we can estimate based on the field passing. We can talk about revenue. We can model it as some sort of growth process. Let's get down to it and actually do a pricing model. So let's assume now you've got a player agent, and that agent is authorized to ask for a 3-year contract. And the first, the one we'll analyze is a 3-year contract where it's triple front loaded. So the first year salary is triple the second and the third. Let's look at a comparable rate for discounting at 3 3/4. Let's look at a very durable player. So they're only looking for a 1% premium for injury risk. Let's assume that this team is willing to commit 50% of their revenue for player salaries over the next 3 years. Let's assume that they've got originally 100 million pounds of revenue, and that this player under consideration is only at an 8% performance share, below the 9.1, but they're also estimated to be in their developmental phase, so they're going to go roughly to a 10% share. Let's assume that correlation is either 0 or 30%. And we should point out that 30% is the figure, if I'm not mistaken, used by Tenara, Clark, and Viney, and I think Colucci and Colucci, if I'm not mistaken. So it's a relatively good number, but it's one that we need more data to estimate, and I'll get to that in a second. Let's assume, though, also that the revenue grows at a 20% volatility, and I've got a 25% volatility for my performance share. Let's assume now also my mean reversion rate is 4. So just to go back real quick to the model, please forgive me. There we go. So theta, think of it as the mean reversion, the strength of the reversion to the mean. Sigma pi is the variability or the standard deviation of my d pi's. My revenue is just a geometric Brownian motion with mean mu and variability or standard deviation sigma r. And pi star is what I'm being pushed towards, that long term. So again, right now underperforming, but expected in the long run to be a overperformer. And so this is the model. So whatever C is for years 2 and 3, I get 3 times that at year 1. And so I discount now for time 1, e to the minus r times 1. And then my value at time 2 is just the single C, e to the minus r times 2, or e to the minus 2r. And I swap that now for my estimated expected present values of my salaries. And so if the S01, S02, S03, I can now estimate, please forgive me for flipping, but I'm going to do this one last time. I can estimate by this formula. And now you can argue that for rho equals 0, that's fine. For rho equals 0.3, H being 1, 2, or 3, it's kind of a coarse estimate. And so you could do this much more precisely. You could argue using a Monte Carlo simulation or solving the PDE with multiple time steps. But nonetheless, let's assume that this is a coarse enough but still reasonable formula. So I can now plug those numbers in and check it out. So my initial salary is 10.6. Then I go down to 3.54, 3.54 for years 2 and 3. If I've got no correlation with revenue. If I have some association with revenue, some correlation, then my salaries go up year over year. So again, reasonable numbers, relatively durable player. Don't expect him to miss much during to injury. We've got a healthy club that's growing at 10% year over year with relatively small, variability. 20% is reasonable. So this is the share that you're going to present back to your client. So in the negotiations, these are some of the things that can come up and say, okay, listen, I mean, this player we can estimate to have nothing to do with revenue. Their performance is not linked to revenue. My revenue is not linked to their performance. If you're a good agent, you're going to argue that, yeah, there's probably should be some. So one of the first things that should pop up in your mind, if you're a quantitative financial analyst, an actuary, or an MBA, just an economist, is, well, there's some sensitivity going on in here. It looks like my compensation, die row, there's a positive sensitivity to correlation. So if my player's performance is positively linked to revenue, there should be some compensation for that. And so this would be something to be interesting for a young person to look at these kinds of models and maybe try to capture those Greeks. We see them a lot in option pricing, portfolio analysis. And the question I would ask is, rhetorically, is this something you would do? Do you want to really commit $10.7 million, let's say, for a player whose performance is correlated to your revenue, and you're only going to give, let's say, 50% of your 100 million, so $50 million, you're committing 10.7 out of $50 million for one player. Would you want to do that in year one? That's a heck of a lot to contribute or to commit, but then that share goes down significantly for years 2 and 3, and your revenue is going up. So you're expected to grow by 10% a year. And if you get through that first year overcommitment of salary, you could argue this player could be a bargain, especially if he's going to go from a roughly 8% to a roughly 10% share. Some things to balance. So again, I know folks came in here to see some soccer stuff, and I promise you I've got some beautiful pictures to show you in a second, but these are the things that are really boring front office things that you got to think about. You got to balance. How much can I contribute? What's he performing at? What's our revenue expected to grow at? Are we capped or not? Is 50% what we can afford to contribute out of our revenue? Can we contribute less? You're going to see that players, in an uncapped league are much less than 50% contributed to total revenue, to total salary, sorry. Okay, skip this guy here. Let's get to the end of this talk, and I know I'm kind of running out of time here, so let me give you the good stuff. So let's assume 30% correlation for 5 years. We're going to look at revenue data, which is available only annually from Deloitte. So if you're a team manager, you're going to have much more refined data. Salary data from Sport Track, game data from Who Scored, game appearance data from Transfer Market. And I've been being a quant finance guy in training. This, I have to say explicitly, these are only our opinions. They don't reflect any of the data sources that we got. They don't reflect anybody else's opinions of the players, the teams, anything. We don't ask you to use this for any sort of investment, gambling, et cetera, just our opinions. Okay, so given these data sources, though, given the fact that we've got yearly data, but what can we do with it? Let's look at 3 teams. Let's look at Liverpool, Arsenal, and Brighton. So Liverpool, obviously Mohamed Salah being in the news recently, but for the last 5 years, been a fantastic striker for Liverpool. Virgil van Dijk being a very stable, leader in the backfield. And then also Trent Alexander-Arnold, creative playmaker. For Arsenal, you've got Eddie Nketiah, Granit Xhaka, and also Rob Holding. There is some consistency, at least for Xhaka, but the other 2 players, you're going to see they missed some games. And then let's look at Brighton, a team that's not necessarily in the spotlight, but this gives us sort of a nice pot of different players to look at and see if this model that we're looking to calibrate has at least some basis in reality. See if it passes the eye test. So we've got Pascal Gross, Solly March, and Lewis Dunk, all with different styles for their game. Okay, so one of the things we're going to try to estimate is this player performance share pie, and also try to get some estimate of revenue, at least do the best we can with annual data instead of game by game data, do some sort of statistical magic. But in doing so, maximum likelihood estimation, these are estimates for the performance share of each of those players. So you can see that Salah is definitely well above the 9.1 average. Alexander Arnold is right at it. Van Dijk is a little bit lower. Granit Xhaka is a little bit above. Those are their long-term expected averages. So you can see that it's not necessarily going to be that every player is going to be contributing above 9.1%, out of a starting 11. The estimates in the parentheses are the standard error, associated with those, and also the driving, the mean reversion parameters theta are also estimated, as well as their sigma pi's. So you can see a player like Salah has got a relatively healthy variation to his contribution. So does Eddie Nketiah, who is also very low for his expected long-term contribution, but there's some hope that his variability, he'll have some really good seasons as well as some not so good seasons. My favorite, though, out of all of this, and for the actuaries, and quants in the audience, is the estimates of lambda. So Salah is at that 1% lambda, but if you look at all the other players, they're quite high. So the risk premium are going to demand for these players, at least empirically estimated lambdas based on their game appearance, is pretty high. So when you're doing this discounting of your random performance share, you have to keep that in mind. It's not something you can neglect. And so this is why I was mentioning earlier that a better actuarial estimate of your game readiness or your risk premium would be very valuable. But these are empirical estimates anyway. Okay, and then also our estimates of the revenue. And again, this is just our academic estimate of it. So we're looking at Liverpool and Brighton having a very healthy 7% year-over-year increase in their revenue. Arsenal is roughly 0, and their sigmas are quite, low. One question would be to look at the Sharpe ratios of each of those teams. But anyway, nonetheless, the performance shares the revenue shares year-over-year, you're looking at roughly 20 to 30%. So not the 50% you might see in some capped leagues. So at least for these three teams, they're contributing between 20 and 30% roughly of their revenue to salaries, at least estimated year over year. Game over game might be different. Okay, so just to finish, we did an estimate in terms of a toy problem. Let's actually finish off with some estimates for real players and what we think our model can show. So in the first slide, I'm going to show you, with a dashed line of being the 9.1% or 1 out of 11 share, that should be the egalitarian average. And we're going to look at each player's contribution above or below that. And then on the second slide, I'm going to show you based on millions of dollars or millions of, dollars. We're also going to show you the fixed salary, which is the thick line, and the also the time series plots as being the actual estimated salary value game by game. So if we could vary game by game what your true salary should be versus your C's, which are your fixed salaries, are you over or underperforming? So if that gap between S and C was really big, if that delta was really big, you could argue that if it's really big in your favor, great. But if it's really big in the player's favor, man, I wish I could get some sort of, default swap or some sort of linked payment to that. So anyway, be a neat idea if we could do it. Here we go. So top left, if you look at Mohamed Salah, he is definitely above the dotted line for his performance. And you can see that all the different colored time series, you can see that he's varying quite nicely around those. Whereas looking at a player like Eddie Nketiah, his average performances are below, but his variability is quite big. And if you look at a player like Granit Xhaka, his performance shares are decreasing, and at the very last year of this contract, you can see he's below the 9.1 share. But again, he's got some nice variability, not too big. So performance share, you can argue from the coaching perspective, game by game, how is this player doing in terms of his connection to his teammates on the field, driving, successful passing. But if you're looking from the front office perspective, let's look at a player like Mohamed Salah again. So he had a fixed contract for those 4 years. And if you look at it, he was overperforming that fixed contract year over year. But in his last year, where you got a new contract, it looks like he's underperforming. And if you look at Trent Alexander-Arnold, same thing. But at last year, the last year he's got it. Sorry, in the last 2 years he is overperforming. In fact, the purple one is highly overperforming. Versus a player again like Eddie Nketiah, based on the revenue associated with his performance, again he's actually underperforming in terms of performance, but overperforming in terms of the dollars that they paid him. So he got paid at a very relatively good fixed contract. So outside of Mohamed Salah and Virgil van Dijk, who looks like he's come back up to, performance relatively close to what he's being paid at, and I think he was up for contract in December, most players are actually undervalued according to this model. And you see sometimes with a new contract, like say like a Lewis Dunk, where you're overperforming, and then bottom right, Lewis Dunk, his very new contract, he's now underperforming. This somewhat passes the eye test. We've all seen this before, sports fans, that you have a premium that's not in here necessarily with injuries, which is liquidity. You don't want this player to go away because you can't replace him that easily, and so you might overpay. And again, if you look at Lewis Dunk from the red 21-22 to 22-23, it's not changing that much. So you're paying him a lot, but if you had done this analysis, you would see that, look, he might look like he's underperforming, but he's only underperforming based on what you're paying him. He's not underperforming based on what he's done historically. In fact, I would argue that he's got a very nice evolution. From 18, 19, 19, 20, 20, 21, there's a lot of variability in those time series, but it's tightening up and actually increasing nicely. You just say you're overpaying him. Now, again, Brighton is a different financial environment than Arsenal or Liverpool, but it's still interesting to see how this can adapt to different environments. Okay. So what I was mentioning there is in these points, I can skip that. What was the benefit of all of this kind of analysis? When I teach my machine learning classes, or specifically to do with, let's say, linear regression, you go right from performance to salary. So you look at historical performance linked salary, and you try to predict what the value of let's say, a hit is. There's a great, obviously the layman database in R, the layman package, you can actually get a really nice set of 31 pitching variables and associate that with pitching salary. And you can do a regression, and you can see it doesn't fit perfectly, but you can do a regression, and you can get the value of a strike or a value of a base on balls and these kinds of things. But it's just basically saying that historically what you've seen, let's say in the past decade, you don't want to do it over too many years because there's inflation. So without adjusting for inflation, both statistically and dollar wise, you can estimate future salary based on performance from what you've seen before. But by injecting what we've done here as a performance share, we've talked about performance linked to revenue, and then how that salary is derived from that increased revenue based on me signing this player or not. Now, there's a couple things that you can do. Number one, you can talk about, well, how does that performance share factor in if I'm transferring, let's say, from an Arsenal to Liverpool or an Arsenal to Brighton? Clearly, if I'm a big fish in a small pond, naturally, my performance share is going to be outsized, at least for some time. But is there a sort of game-by-game other approach? So one of the things we've been working on, and for another talk maybe, is looking at the Moneyball theorem or the Pythagorean exponent. You can look at that year over year, but could you do it dynamically game over game? And so we've been doing some work with Jimmy, who I'm going to volunteer as another guy to come and give a talk. That's at the beginning, you're looking for speakers. Jimmy's a fantastic speaker and superstar data scientist. We're working on this with Tai Ho Wang, also at Baruch College. And then also centrality measures. We didn't really use a page rank or an in-betweenness, these kinds of things. But could you link those measures to what we did here, which is more of a probability-based, successful shot-based probability valuation? And so that'd be an interesting question for any graph theorists in the room. And if you wanted to see sort of a nice example of how to derive those performance shares, Jimmy, as part of our publication, the reviewers or the editors asked us to put up some code. So on his GitHub page, you can see a lot of the code that we used to solve this problem. And we'd love for people to modify it and use it in whatever they want to do. So to finish off, just want to thank Jimmy. He's a fantastic friend and just one of the most interesting humans I've met. Definitely interesting because he's kind of like my son. I don't think he's a native sports fan. My son, I'm trying. It is really hard. It's mostly just Star Wars for him, but for me, I'm a diehard sports fan, and so watching Jimmy approach this objectively has been a lot of fun. I want to thank David, obviously, for the invite, and my good buddy Jeff Williams, who I went to grad school with at SFU, and who's now back in the math department, dear friend of mine. Here at the university in our graduate certificate sports analytics, our chair Jeff Schenker, Emilio Esposito, and Leonard Johnson, Darian Harris, who I've had a chance to really connect with. He is a Rose Bowl and Cotton Bowl champion here at MSU football, now back as an assistant director. And we're looking at expanding some of this model to do with name, image, and likeness. As you've probably heard here in the United States, the NCAA and name, image, and likeness is definitely a big topic of discussion. And Bill Burghardt, who's the director of sports science here for the MSU football team, we've also had some great discussions, and we're doing lots of good stuff. And finally, all the kids that I've worked with, our sports analytics club and our contract pricing class, where I did some of this stuff initially with them. They're fantastic. And most of all, for the last 40 minutes or so, everybody here that came in trying to learn about soccer and you got a finance seminar instead. Thank you, everybody, for attending. So I'd love to answer any questions, any comments, and just want to say thank you again.
Awesome. Thanks, Albert. And yeah, I don't know if anyone had any illusions about what kind of talk they were going to get. When you attend a sports analytics seminar, you got to be pretty much ready for anything.
Yep.
Okay, so I'll open it up for questions. So if you want to just raise your hand, virtually, and then I'll point at you to unmute and ask your question. So please don't be shy. Yeah, my knowledge of financial math is so is about limited to what you said today, and then I'd have to go through it all and learn all the terms. So yeah, I don't have a lot of questions myself, but did you mention so you mentioned other sports. I was kind of curious about that, but
Mhm.
also like just how do you quantify defense that doesn't involve passing? Or like, how does that contribute to the performance share?
It's a great question. It's not specifically in this model. And so, for example, defense just by like staring down the opposing defender or kind of blocking, interference in the legal sense, that's a great question. It's not actually in this model, but it could be something we could use to adjust it.
Yeah, and then I guess the same would hold true for goalkeepers. Like, they're not featured in this model unless but they could pass the ball, I guess.
They are featured in this model. So,
Yeah,
so defense is heavily featured in this model since that you can have people in the backfield that are directing play, just like in hockey, the
yeah,
goalie, you've seen goalies score empty net goals, but goalies do get assists.
yeah. Okay, great. Jonas.
Okay, well, I could honestly ask you about 55 questions. Such a fantastic topic. Thank you so much. And
Thank you.
I'll say to everyone, I mean, this is the game now. I mean, this is where it's at. Honestly, the further I get away from coaching on field with all the licenses and a whistle and a tactics board, the more the game is requiring these skills.
Mhm.
And so I wonder, in terms of combining this objective method with the subjective,
Mhm.
what advice would you have maybe for like some of our students who are, you know, I think maybe if they don't have the soccer specific background in terms of directing their studies, because this area is the most in demand area in the game. In fact, every job I have applied for recently as the video analyst or performance analyst requires at least an awareness of this field. And more and more, I'm actually becoming less and less qualified to do the work. So how would you direct maybe somebody, like we have some brilliant students here at SFU who are currently diving into this field, and I'm trying to help them and direct them. Um, how would you suggest in the current climate, people work with maybe having less of the soccer specific or football specific background but having, the sort of the statistics and the data and the analytics background, how would you suggest they bridge that gap?
I appreciate it. It's a great question. And um, I agree that, the two things that I'm seeing the most of are either it's like dynamic ticket pricing, revenue linked things, or performance share. I'm sorry, performance and performance analytics, like a kinesiologist that's a data scientist as well. Those are two things I'm seeing a lot of on LinkedIn, that jobs that are popping up, especially in Europe for soccer teams. Um, but I'd say the first thing is to kind of have a paradigm, kind of have an idea. And so my favorite book has to be Easton and Rockerby's, contract options for buying talent in sports, something like, I forget the title, but those two gentlemen, what they did is they really threw down the gauntlet and they said, okay, fine, this is a structural model. What do teams do? They put an entertainment product on the field, but that entertainment product is also linked to, performance on the field in terms of a revenue figure. And so they kind of hint at a little bit of the Scully model, but they do it from an option theoretic model, which is binomial. Did the player overperform or did he underperform? And so instead of doing this kind of heavy duty stochastic stuff, you can just do a simple random walk year to year. So in this year, did the player overperform? Did he underperform? And attach probabilities to that, probability of heads or tails, let's say. And then you can do a multi-year analysis, and then you can talk about, well, what happens if you have, optionality? What if you want to, have the 3-year contract where you have an option after the second year to re-sign or not? They do a really good job of exposing that analysis. So I guess my first tip would be to chat with Stephen Easton. I'm amazed that he's there, and I never had a chance to meet him. And use his book as something to say, hey, this is something to read. And then talk to folks like Jeff Williams and other folks in the math and the stats department. I mean, Tim Swartz, who is a superstar, obviously in our field as well. I use his hockey analytics, write up for my students when I had them as professorial assistants. I guess my first thing is have some sort of foundational references, and start with very basic models. This stuff is linked to the things I did as a grad student and some of the stuff I do in quant finance. So this kind of reasoning is what I've been. This is the ocean I've been swimming in for the last 20 years. But the very basic thing would be a binomial model that's referenced in Rockerby and Easton. That's where I would start. The other thing is, so we work with MSU hockey, and one of the things that our students do is every game they're in the press box, and they're just, is that a pass or is that a deflected shot? Was that a hit or incidental contact? And we have two pairs of eyes, and they have to communicate, what do you think? And the great thing is that our students, when they graduate, they have the playbook for the next kids. And the two of the students that set it up, they are actually now the Dallas Stars. And they were, spotlit in the NHL and the Dallas Morning News. But they got their start exactly what you're doing, Jonas, is just they had somebody that said, hey, go take data, plot it out. What do you see? What are some things we could do? And their enthusiasm took it the rest of the way.
That's great to hear, because we literally have our second round of students doing that with our soccer teams right now. Had a game on Wednesday night. Student was, again, somebody, with more of that academic background, learning how to identify an entry into the attacking third by channel and taking those data sets. What's a connection? Just a quick follow-up question.
Sure.
Are there any clubs, whether they're in the Premier League or not, it's definitely not my beloved Fulham, that are really doing this well, that are applying, if you want to call it Moneyball concepts, that are really applying these models for contract valuation? Are there any clubs that you could reference that are doing this really well by, taking what we always have, which is the subjective opinion of a player, right? I think I'm a Fulham supporter, but I can recognize how good Virgil van Dijk is. Taking that subjective measure and applying these concepts, is what club is doing this the best in the world of, let's say, soccer?
It's a fantastic question. I don't know off the top of my head. I know the Stats LLC is sort of the big player in terms of supplying that kind of data in terms of game performance. But has anybody linked it to revenue? And again, like there's always the grumbling of this guy's overpaid or this guy's underpaid. But having as a game by game analysis, we just published this a few months ago. It's been out for about a year, but I haven't seen anything like that. And you could argue it can create a moral hazard. Like I can oversign a player and just let the insurance market take it over, right? obviously that's not the goal, but can we at least have a dollar valuation of how this player did in this game and relative to his weekly wages? I haven't seen it yet, but I have seen a lot of things like the Arsenals, the Liverpools. When I was at Carnegie Mellon Sports Conference in 2023, Sarah Rudd spoke, and I think she started this a lot of soccer analytics at Arsenal, and she's got her own consultancy now here in the U.S., I believe. So there is a lot of soccer analytics going on in Europe, but as far as this, I don't know.
All right. Thank you. Yeah, I keep hearing Arsenal as well, as much as I hate to admit that.
I'm a Manchester United fan. I went to a conference in Manchester. I know, and I got to go to the Theater of Dreams and walk around, and yeah.
Great. Thanks for your questions, Jonas. Does anyone else want to answer or ask a question? Please raise your hand. And maybe I'll just ask one final one, sort of. Yeah. So, like, we talk about value in terms of revenue, but of course, most fans aren't concerned with revenue. They're concerned with something else, whether it's just straight up winning or some sort of entertainment value. uh, can your model be adapted to that? I mean, I guess obviously you need parameter estimates and you need to operationalize entertainment or whatever it is the fan experience, whatever the fans seek. But do you have any thoughts on that?
Absolutely. So there's the reputational value versus performance value. So reputational value obviously has a big impact here in college sports as well, I would argue, especially with NIL, name, image, and likeness becoming a big deal here. In a nutshell, you could say there are some secondary effects to do with your performance share. If you've got a high performance share player, that player's, in every single game, you know, think of like a Rob Gronkowski, grabbing touchdowns. He's also a really interesting guy. He has some brands like Pit Viper that I love their sunglasses, but he's also a fantastic player. And then you might have some players that are really, fan favorites that maybe are underproducing, but their jerseys still sell pretty well. So, in a nutshell, yes, there is a lot of room to add reputational valuation in here. And also, just to go back, that also has to do with the transfer market value, or specifically at the end of a contract, you could sell the rights to that player. And you could argue that in some continents, that's the business model, right? You develop players to sell them to big European soccer clubs to sell their contracts. So um, definitely the valuation model is not part of this. And that's something I would love to see sort of a combining with what we're doing with sort of the TCV, Colucci and Coluccia sort of transfer value valuation of players. Short answer is yes. And then obviously, there's the scarcity. There's one Leo Messi. And when he comes here, your whole TV revenue model changes, right? Now, Apple TV bases a lot of what they're showing you based on Inter Miami and Messi. So there's lots of things like that going on, I would argue.
Yeah, no, that's pretty fascinating. Okay, doesn't look like we have any additional questions, so I'm going to stop the recording here. But before I do, let's all give Albert a round of applause and thank him for joining us for a really interesting talk. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.